It's about love, not cash. Stealing money from the poor's a bit rash. Line your pockets, fill your tanks with your rockets. Look at it, we just can't stop it. Loving your neighbour with bombs is wrong. Loving your neighbour with bombs is wrong. Just don't become late. That's the only rule. Loving your neighbour with bombs is wrong. Loving your neighbour with bombs is wrong. All been going on way too long.
Welcome to another podcast. I'm here with Dr. Richard Lewis Miller, who we have been trying to connect with for a very long time. I'm very glad we made it happen today. So, Richard, thanks for being here.
You're welcome. It's great to be here after all our hard work.
Yeah, exactly. So I have Richard's book here. It's called Psychedelic Medicine, The Healing Powers of LSD, MDMA, Psilocybin, and Ayahuasca. And the book is very much a summary of a lot of the research that's been done over the years on these substances. And I found the book fascinating. It's a really interesting book, even for someone like me who has been learning about the stuff, looking into these studies. There was a lot of information that I didn't know, a lot of stuff about these studies I hadn't known about. So it's a great resource. I really enjoyed it. I would recommend it to anyone who wants to learn about sort of the science that's being done, the research, the legal research being done on these subjects. So yeah, very interesting book. We're going to talk a bit about that. And hopefully in this podcast, what I want to do is tell people who maybe don't know about this stuff, who don't have experience with something like ayahuasca or LSD in any kind of beneficial manner. I want to talk about how these things can be used to help people. And Richard is a really great guest to talk about this with. So that's where we're going to start. Maybe Richard, to start out, before we go into the sort of the history and things of how these have been used, maybe you could just explain in some kind of some way how it feels for someone to go into the experience with something like magic mushrooms or LSD or MDMA. What is this experience like for a person?
Well, thank you, Carl. To begin with, most people already have preconceived notions of what psychedelics are going to be like. And the preconceived notions can be anywhere from they're going to be happy and fun to they're going to be scary.
Right. Yeah.
And so a lot of misinformation has been put out to the public. And a lot of it is this misinformation has been put out for political reasons. And so one of the reasons I created the book is I wanted the public to get a picture of what research in 2018 looks like in psychedelic medicine. What is the real research, the stuff that's being done at the very highest levels of research that is capable? And so in the book, we have people from Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Roland Griffiths and Karen McLean. We have Charlie Grobe down at UCLA Med. We have Dr. Dave Nichols at the University of Indiana, Dr. Michael Mithofer, Dr. Stan Groff, and on and on and on. So these are the most prominent researchers in the United States, if not in the world, in the area of psychedelic medicine.
Yeah.
And these are very courageous people, Carl, because these are people who risk their reputations in the face of public and political hysteria about substances. They risk their reputations, their big reputations. These are people at the highest schools. You know, we're talking about big famous universities, and they risk their reputations knocking on the door of the government year after year after year, trying to get permission to do a little research after over 50 years of government obstacles and suppression of research.
Right. Yeah.
For some of us, the governmental suppression of the research is almost unfathomable. How can you deny research? But yet we have.
Right. So that's something, maybe I'll interrupt you just for a moment and just point out that these substances have been illegal, not just for personal consumption, but even for people wanting to do scientific research. It's been very, very difficult for people to get permission to do this. These have been that illegal.
They've been that illegal. Having the substances in your possession has been a federal crime. So in order to do research, you have to keep knocking on the government's door until they finally grant a few people permission. And then you have to get the substances from the government. That's the only way to get it if you're going to do the research. So it's been difficult, and it's been extremely so for, as I said, over 50 years.
Yeah.
But now we have. But what we also have, in addition to the modern research, is we have retrospective research. For example, in my case, I'm old enough that I was able to be administered LSD and MDMA when they were still legal.
Right.
So I can bring personal experiences that were legal experiences to the table, as well as the modern research, which can be extremely helpful and certainly helpful in answering your question.
Right. So we can say that, in the 60s, before the sweeping legalization or illegalization of all these things, they were being tested for therapeutic purposes even then.
All over the world. The English were way ahead of us, doing all kinds of research on LSD for treating alcoholism.
Right. Yeah.
Way ahead. LSD became illegal in the United States in 1967, and then the United States went on a campaign to make it illegal around the world.
Right.
MDMA became illegal in 1985. I was very fortunate that I had a therapist in the early 80s, Dr. Robert Cantor with a K, who administered MDMA to me in his office. So here I want to make a differentiation for your listeners, and my readers, perhaps. And that is, the differentiation, Carl, is that the same substance, X, can be both a drug and a medicine. And this is a very important differentiation.
Okay, yeah.
When a person gets something on the street and decides on a Saturday morning they're going to pop some of it in their mouth, they're taking drugs.
Right.
When a person gets something that's made in a laboratory that is certified, and they go through a protocol, that means a specific way of administration, then they're taking medicine. And this is very different. And what we're talking about today, and what I talk about in my book, are psychedelic medicines.
Right.
Taking of these same substances as drugs is a whole nother category, and it's a whole nother discussion that we're not going to have today.
Right.
We're going to be talking only about taking these substances as a medicine.
Right. That these things have the potential to be used for people's benefit, that people can choose to use them in a way that is more like it actually is medicinal and not just sporadic drug use for kicks kind of thing.
Well, and I'm not besmirching or criticizing those who want to use substances for, quote, kicks or recreational purposes or sex.
It's just a different thing.
Or rock and roll. That's a whole different category. I'm simply not addressing that today.
Yeah, gotcha.
Because that brings with it a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
We are talking here about taking something as a medicine. When you take something as a medicine, your number one rule is do no harm. That's what it means, do no harm, which means you have to be doing no harm and hopefully doing some good.
Right, or at least having the good far outweigh anything harmful.
Exactly, because sometimes there are, even in the best of medicines, what's called side effects.
Yeah, for sure.
Although they don't really happen on one side, they happen all over the body, and they shouldn't be called side effects because that minimizes them. Right. They should be called, in my opinion, unwanted complications of medicine.
Yeah.
That's what they really are. They're unwanted complications.
Right.
Okay, let's get back to your question of what the experience is initially like.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about experiences with 3 different psychedelic medicines right now.
Okay.
I'll talk about it from a research point of view, and I'll talk about it from a personal point of view when I was administered it professionally with guidance in a medicinal protocol.
Right.
Okay? MDMA. MDMA is a medicine which opens up the heart. It's much more of a heart emotion medicine than it is a head medicine.
Right.
So MDMA doesn't necessarily create more interesting thoughts or lend itself to a lot of intellectual creativity, although that's possible. But what it does lend itself to is authentic, honest, non-defensive communication. So we found it's an excellent medicine for couples therapy.
Right.
So that couples can open and speak from their hearts with much less mediation from the head and the ego, which gets in the way with defensiveness and name calling and accusation.
Yeah.
And there's griping, right? And much more listening. And so the heart opens up, and people can speak in a very non-defensive way, and even equally or more importantly, can listen to what the other person is saying,
Right.
with their words, with their body language, with their facial expression, because we are totally communicating when we're communicating.
Right.
Our hands speak, our shoulders speak,
Yeah.
our faces speak. Every part of us is speaking. Words are just like grunts.
It's just part of it. Yeah.
They're just sounds that over time we've agreed upon have some meaning.
Right.
But obviously they're not universal, because there are thousands of languages around the planet, which means people all over the planet agreed on different sounds
Yeah.
for the same thing, right?
Yeah.
A chair is a chair for us, but it's a C in Spanish, etc.
Mm-hmm.
A window is a window, but it's a ventana,
Yeah.
and so on. People have so there are different grunts. However, there may be, and many of us believe, there is much more universality of communication in facial expression and body language. Because the body language speaks as the animal speaks, and there's much more similarity.
Right.
But getting back to MDMA, so MDMA we could call, for a headline, the heart opener, the softener,
Right.
the moderator, the allower of non-defensive communication with other.
So just to summarize there, you're saying that someone taking MDMA, they're not necessarily going to see hallucinations or visions or things like that. Maybe what people have heard of seeing things that aren't there. You're not going to see that type of stuff on MDMA for the most part, but it will help you, if used in this way, it'll help you connect to other people in a way that it might be very difficult to do without it.
Might be impossible to do without it. And I want to underline something you said, Carl. You said, you won't see, hallucinations, or you definitely won't.
Right.
You will not see anything other than what you ordinarily see.
Right.
Your vision won't change. Sounds may change in the sense of you may feel more sensitive to the sounds. You may feel a better understanding of the tone that the other person is using.
Right.
Almost as if, oh my gosh, I can understand what that tone means.
Right.
Or, oh my gosh, I think I can really read what that facial expression means. It's saying something to me. So there's an enhancement of communication, but there is not a distortion or hallucinations or audio hallucinations at all.
Right. So that's something that people might not have heard about. People think of MDMA as ecstasy and they hear about it as this party drug kind of thing. But what we're trying to emphasize here is that this can be used in a totally different way and be very helpful for something like couples therapy, or it's being used with PTSD and people recovering from things like that.
It is the research so far that has been done has very much been around post-traumatic stress disorder with returning veterans.
Right.
Dr. Michael Midhofer, who's in my book, talks about that. And that's been very important research for being able to heal those wounds. And we're expecting at this point, Carl, that MDMA will be a legitimate legal prescription medicine by the year 2020 or 2021.
Right. That's pretty
Phase
soon.
3 trial, pretty soon. It's coming along. And that will be a wonderful return to pre-1985, when people like my doctor were able to give it to me.
Right.
Now, I want to just say a little more about when Dr. Cantor gave it to me in order to give your viewers more information on this.
Sure.
I arrived at his office at 9 o'clock in the morning. He administered the medicine at 9:15 a.m. The medicine took effect at 10 o'clock. We had a therapy session together from 10 o'clock until 12 noon. At 1 o'clock, I left his office and was able to drive back to my office. And by 4 o'clock that afternoon, I was back in my office working and seeing patients. So that's an important thing to know, because this isn't a medicine that takes the entire day or needs to.
Right.
And it isn't a medicine who puts you in a psychedelic space case hallucination, hearing voices and melting windows and all that.
Yeah.
That's not what it's like. It's very specific, and it's very time limited.
Yeah.
MDMA, when given professionally, is a different substance than what's on the street called ecstasy.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
We don't know what's on the street called ecstasy. We really don't.
Yeah.
Because we've got people who pick up samples of ecstasy all around the United States and send them in for analysis. And we get a wide variety of stuff that people are taking, calling ecstasy.
Yeah.
And that's how it is with black market substances. There's no safety and regulation.
Right. Which is another reason to legalize this stuff, because it actually makes it safer for everybody.
Given that tens of millions of people are experimenting with, it would make it much safer for them if they could buy it in a drugstore. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
But again, we're not talking about that use. We're talking about use as a medicine in psychotherapy to enhance therapy and personal growth and development.
Yeah.
That's the story. Now, if MDMA is the heart medicine, then I'd say LSD approaches to a certain extent being the head medicine.
Yeah.
Although it's also body related because it has a big effect on sexual activity. But the LSD has to be seen from two different perspectives. One perspective is what you'd call a full dose of LSD. And one perspective is what you might call a homeopathic dose, or a very tiny amount.
Yeah.
The very tiny amount has been called microdosing, because you're taking a micro amount of a microscopic amount to begin with.
Yeah.
Remember, LSD comes in micrograms, not milligrams.
Yeah.
Not grams, but micrograms. So it's a tiny, tiny amount, and a microdose of a microgram is even tinier. So we're going to talk about two different ways of taking LSD.
Okay, yeah.
In the full amount, it is a genuine psychedelic. And it can create visual changes, such as looking in the sky and seeing clouds as ballet dancers, or seeing all kinds of animals or people as if the clouds are forming those pictures for you. One could see movement. One might look at it. I've had the experience of looking at a Persian rug, and it seems to come alive, and every little thread in the rug is moving.
Right.
With LSD, it becomes apparent that nothing is really solid, that everything that we see as solid is really molecules stuck together
Right.
but they're stuck together so well that they feel solid.
Yeah.
But as we know, when you take an axe to almost anything, you can cleave the molecules apart.
Yeah.
And with LSD, this can visually become apparent. It can appear as though you can actually see the molecular structure of things. So LSD can be used for healing. It can also be used for creativity. So Watson and Crick, when just doing the work which won them, I believe, the Nobel Prize for the double helix of DNA, they used LSD for their creative research. We know that Steve Jobs used LSD for his creative research with Apple.
Right.
We know that the great astrophysicist Carl Sagan used LSD in his research, and there are others. So there's plenty of evidence, and we have it from when before 1967, when LSD was legal, that LSD can be used for addressing a specific creative problem or for creativity in general. When I say a specific creative problem, architects have used it when they're dealing with building a particular kind of structure, and they're in some kind of an impasse and they want to make a breakthrough.
Yeah.
And okay, so that is another way to use it. So there's healing, there's creativity, and then there's a third way that I'm particularly interested in.
What's that?
If you've had the experience, Carl, of cutting your hand or part of your body, having the skin ripped and it bleeds, correct?
Yes.
Now, throughout your life, when that's happened, hasn't that piece of ripped skin always healed? Has it formed a scab and then it healed and the scab fell off?
That's right.
Well, who was in charge of that healing?
It's hard to say. But I think I know where you're going, though.
Well, somebody had to have been in charge of that. And I'm saying it was you, because I don't think it was anybody outside of you that would said, I think I'm going to participate in healing that cut on Carl's body.
Yeah.
Right? You with me?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So if you were in charge of that healing, then I think what we agree on is, yes, you were in charge, but it wasn't in your volitional control. It wasn't as if you said, okay, I just got cut. I'm going to give you 3 hours and 26 seconds or 6 days and 10 minutes, and I want that healed and the scab gone, right?
Yeah.
It feels automatic to you. Correct?
Yeah.
Like breathing. It feels like an automatic process.
You just assume it's going to happen.
Correct. But suppose, for example, you could take volitional control of that healing. Suppose you had the tools to focus your mind on the particular area that needs healing and aid the healing process.
Right.
I think LSD offers us the key to how to train the mind to focus on healing that's already happening involutionally, so that it becomes a voluntary process that we take charge of.
Right. Now that's an amazing idea, and that's something I actually planned on asking you about, because it comes up in your book a couple of times. I believe you asked Stan Groff about it in the interview in the book, about that idea. And it's really a fascinating idea, and something that, if you really think about, it doesn't seem that crazy, because I think one thing I mentioned a lot on this podcast is the placebo effect, that we know that's a real legit thing in science. They usually test against in science. They have to create blind or double-blind studies to prevent the placebo effect altering the results. And that's just people believing or thinking something is going to be healed in a certain way, often in these kind of studies, and then it actually becoming the case. I've mentioned a study that they've tested people who were getting knee surgeries, and they ended up cutting some of the people open and not doing anything to their knee, but just stitching it back up, and they ended up healing just as fast as the people who did have the surgery done. It's amazing.
I'm familiar with that study.
Yeah. And so you're talking about sort of like utilizing this placebo effect that we call this mind connection to our body and actually directing how we're healing things. And I've thought about it since reading your book. And it's not that we would have to necessarily have exact dictatorship over all of the different cells and know all the processes of all the healing cells. It would be something more in line of, if I want to move my hand, I don't have to know the intricacies of all the muscles in my arm. I just think about moving my hand, and that connection, that pathway is there, and I'm able to do that. And it's kind of like creating that pathway in connection with sort of, you could say, healing physical things in our body and being able to just direct those energies or that thing to that specific area. It's a fascinating idea.
What you're saying is exactly what I'm talking about. It's using neural pathways to have the mind focus on an area of the body. And you're right, you don't have to know the anatomy or the actual pathways.
Mm-hmm.
You can do it with inner visualization, and go to your kidney or go to your liver or go to your pancreas and create inner healing.
Right.
That's what I'm talking about. And I believe that LSD will provide the key to focusing. See, what this is about is focusing the mind.
Right.
And I don't believe we have not learned yet. We're too young and early on in our development. So we haven't learned yet to do that kind of focusing. But as you have well pointed out, we have evidence from the placebo effect of the power of the mind to create that kind of healing.
Yeah.
So the next step is to harness that power and make use of it ourselves.
It's an amazing idea. And this is obviously going a little bit beyond just the sort of introduction to how these things might help. This is still sort of a theoretical idea. So why is it that it's LSD in particular you think could help us work in this way?
Because of the power of the particular substance. Because it's something that we're taking in micrograms, in little tiny amounts, and yet it has the power to have a change in our neurotransmitters that is remarkable. And for your listeners and your viewers who are really interested in this, they might go to the New York Times archives and look up the name Amanda Fielding. Amanda Fielding.
Mm-hmm.
And Amanda Fielding published in the New York Times digital images of the brain under normal conditions and the brain under the influence of LSD.
Right.
And the digital images, I see you're shaking your head, so you've seen them.
Mm-hmm.
They're remarkable.
Yeah.
It's almost as if LSD lights up the brain and allows us access to parts of ourselves that heretofore we do not have access to.
Right.
It's as there's a wall there, and we're using a little part, and here's this other whole part. And oh boy, what a thing when we can use the whole instead of the part.
Yeah. Well, that brings up a few things that I wanted to mention on this podcast, but we can go into one just being, it seems like how some of these psychedelics work, including LSD and probably psilocybin, is you're adding this thing, but what it's doing is not just adding something to the brain, it's actually shutting down a part of the brain that seems to regulate the rest of the brain. I forget the name of it. Do you know what I'm referring to?
I don't know what you're referring to, Carl.
It's like the part of the brain that sort of people might call the ego, or it's like some kind of...
Well, that's what MDMA, as I said before, appears to take down the wall of defensiveness of of guardedness. Let me be careful here of what I say and
Yeah,
what that
right.
person says, and skepticism and suspicion, and instead we presume innocence and we
Right.
presume the best.
And then that allows you to communicate with someone in a very open way that you might normally be too afraid to do so. You might be more guarded and whatever without these. But I think it works. I think some of these other things work in the brain in a similar way, where they bring down the regulation of the brain and allow ideas to sort of flow. And it seems like some of those brain mappings show that like parts of the brain that don't normally communicate to one another are now communicating, or now sending signals back and forth. And
that is correct.
Yeah.
So there's more intra brain communication, and there's more access for us to our brains, so that we have more access and more information available. It's almost like the difference between having 50 computers on your desk and you can only use one of them.
Right.
All of a sudden, you have access to all 50
You
of them.
link them all together. Yeah.
And they're all linked together. What a hot dog.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
So you mentioned Amanda Fielding, and that was someone I was actually specifically going to bring up as well, because of the interview that you have in your book with her about her study on psilocybin mushrooms and depression. Because to me, that was one of the most amazing just examples of how powerful these things can be. And I mean, I can give a brief synopsis of the study. They were studying people who had long-term depression. They were studying people who had been depressed on average 18 years, I believe it was. And these people, obviously, if you're depressed for 18 years, you're trying to not be depressed. So I'm sure some of these people had been through therapy, probably been through other medications and things, but they found themselves in this study. And how it worked was they took psilocybin 2 different weekends, I think it was. They took it one day, then had sort of a follow-up with the therapist, and they stayed the night, and they went home the next morning. And then the next weekend, they did the same thing, used psilocybin with a therapist present, and talked about it, I think, afterward or the next day. And then it was a week later. So this is, weeks after the first experience, and 1 week after the second. They were followed up with and asked how they were feeling and if they were still depressed. And it was 67% of the people who had been depressed for 18 years said they were no longer feeling the symptoms of depression. It was amazing. I just started laughing when I read it, because it's such a clear example of the power of these things.
Roland Griffiths and Catherine McLean at Johns Hopkins did a similar study where they took people who were depressed and gave them, with a protocol, that means a procedure, 1 administration of psilocybin mushrooms. 1 year later, there were still positive results of a significant number of people. When you compare that to what the big pharmaceutical companies are selling the American public, taking SSRIs 365 days a year and messing with their neurotransmitters 365 days a year versus a medicine that you can take once. It's quite remarkable. And yet psilocybin is illegal, and the use of it in therapy is illegal. Excuse me for a second.
Okay.
Just got to get a wire here to make sure this thing stays. Okay, good.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It's amazing that studies like that can exist and they can show these amazing results, and yet this stuff is still illegal. It
remains illegal, and there's very little hope in sight for psilocybin becoming illegal in the near future. And the same with LSD. I wanted to come back to LSD because I talked about a large dose, and I talked about it for a little bit for healing. I talked about its use in problem solving and creativity. But there's another aspect of LSD, which is to take 10% of a dose. 10% of a dose is referred to as a microdose.
Right. Yeah.
When a person takes 10% of a dose, one does not feel it. one does not have auditory and visual hallucinations. One can go about one's day.
Right.
However, there are results, and the results are significant. And Ayelet Waldman wrote a book called A Really Good Day, in which she talks about having been bipolar for 20 years and taken every single medicine known to the pharmacopoeia and got nowhere. And then she took a microdose of LSD, and at the end of the day, and during the day she noticed nothing. And at the end of the day, she said to her husband, Michael Chabon, the author, she said, "Wow, I had a really good day." That's what she named her book, A Really Good Day.
Right.
Because it's a medicine that is sub rosa. You don't even know that you're on it, and yet it has a positive effect without negative side effects.
Right.
And it's being used now under the table by possibly tens of millions of people.
Yeah.
But again, it's illegal, and we cannot recommend it for that reason.
Right.
We can talk about it the way we are on this program.
Yeah.
And thank you for the opportunity to talk about it on the program.
Yeah, thank you. You're so knowledgeable about this stuff. You've obviously been talking to people about it for so long, and you've had your own experiences before with it. So you speak with an authority about this stuff, that you know it can work because you've talked to all these people, looked into all of these studies. It's very clear that it can work for people, even in these small doses, like you're saying, when you're taking this and you're not feeling any psychedelic effects whatsoever. So it's the actual chemical itself being in your system in some way is reacting and changing whatever it's changing in your body to have these effects. It's really, so it works on just a very physical level. It's not just like this mental stimulation that's happening.
There is hardly anything, and you're not. The rule of thumb with a microdose is, if you can feel it, you took too much.
Right. You don't want to feel it.
And what we're dealing with here, Carl, with having these incredible medicines that have such positive effect on post-traumatic stress disorder, on LSD, on cluster headaches,
right,
that the English are doing, with convulsions that the pharmaceutical companies are using cannabis for.
Yeah.
With each of these medicines, ketamine we're going to talk about, having them there, so powerful and so potentially beneficial to mankind, and maintaining them as illegal is like having most of the world screaming that the world is flat. And a few of us are saying, wait a minute, it's round. You can't fall off the edge if you go to the edge. All you do is curve around.
Yeah.
That's we're telling you, take a boat and try it. You're gonna stay stuck to the earth as you make that turn. You're not gonna fall off into outer space.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world is saying, you're going to fall off into outer space. You're going to take this and you're going to go crazy. You're going to jump off a building. You're going to commit suicide. All these scare tactics.
Right.
And there's reason for the scare tactics, Carl. And I want to say what the reason is.
Yeah.
These medicines have the potential for waking people up, for allowing them to see what is really going on around them and in the world. And that presents a danger to all governments, because governments want the status quo.
Right.
First and foremost, what governments want is to keep their jobs and get paid by us. That's what they want.
Yeah.
We have this system in the United States that's absolute madness, where we have congressmen and women who run for office every 2 years. What that means is the minute they go to work the first day, they're already running for office in 2 years.
They're worried about losing and maintaining their jobs.
Imagine if all the rest of us workers, as soon as we got to work, had to start campaigning to keep our job.
Yeah.
Half our time or more would be spent campaigning to keep our job. It's a crazy system.
Yeah.
absolute madness. We don't get enough work out of them because they're campaigning so much of the time. And the second problem is we've now allowed them to be influenced by corporate money with that Citizens United Supreme Court deal. So what that means is they're being influenced by big money and they have to run for office constantly. That's a combination. That's a killer. That's an absolute killer, right?
Sure.
And so these people want the status quo. And these psychedelic medicines have the potential to upset the status quo because people will learn things and see things and start thinking for themselves in ways that they may not have done before. And that is a danger to government. And that is the main reason why these medicines are kept illegal.
Okay. That's something I was planning on asking you about because that comes up in the book as well. And what I want to ask, I suppose, is do you think it comes down to sort of corrupt ignorance, or do you think it's actually more conspiratorial than that, and that the people up there who have power know the power of these substances and the power they have to potentially change things, and that they are purposefully keeping them illegal? Or is it sort of, maybe say if you look at like a pharmaceutical company that thinks, oh, if these things become legal, I'm going to lose millions of dollars. So they're paying off politicians, and it's more that sense that they're being kept illegal.
I'm not a conspiratorial thinker.
No.
I think it's more you do something over and over and over again, and after a while it becomes a habit. We got the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution spawned bigger and bigger companies. You can see it around in your lifetime. Smaller companies are being eaten up by bigger and bigger. The local hardware store it gets eaten up by Costco. A local dry goods store gets eaten up by Walmart. Smaller steel companies get bought out by bigger steel companies. Smaller oil companies get bought out by bigger, et cetera, et cetera. So the capitalist materialist system favors bigness because it's just an outgrowth of the system. It's nobody's fault and it's not a conspiracy. Companies get bigger and bigger. They have the power to influence. So it's not like we'll sit in the back room and think who we can screw up. It happens as a result of getting so big, you have more power. You can hire spend 10, 20 million on lobbying and so on in order to help your business. Not necessarily to help people, hurt people, but to help your business. However, as this gets bigger and bigger and more out of control, people do get hurt. And people get badly hurt. And so the tobacco companies keep pumping out tobacco because that's their business and their livelihoods are at stake. Yet every single day they go to work, they're making a product that's going to end up hurting some human being because there is no benefit from sitting around and inhaling nicotine. I mean, there just isn't. But they're still making billions of dollars selling these little things that you smoke and bring into your system and then create a health problem. And I don't think those people are sitting around, conspiring to make millions of people sick. They're caught up in it.
That's just the side effect of what they're doing. And so
it's a side effect of what they're doing. Thomas Jefferson warned us. He said, you better rewrite the Constitution every 20 years because there are new generations and new things happening and you'll be stuck in the past if you don't. Well, it's over 200 years and we haven't rewritten it. So we still have these congressmen every 2 years running for office.
And so what you're referring to with the politicians is like the politicians, because they have to keep their jobs, they're not out there saying things that are controversial. They don't want to put their neck on the line at all. So they're not going to stand up for things like this because it's not popular to do so. But it's not that
That's right. Nobody that works for McDonald's is going to start screaming, I think we ought to use organic meat. They're not going to do it because they're going to lose their job if they scream too loud. And the same thing with the Congress people. They want to do what it takes to get the vote so they can keep getting paid. That's where it's at. Everybody wants that. It's not that they're unique. Everybody wants to keep their job.
People are just operating from that place of fear of losing what they have.
Fear of loss is a major motivator, and it's a very sad one that we're generating so much fear in this country. And one of the things that's happened to me and many people I know who were fortunate enough to take these psychedelic medicines while they were legal is that we lost our fear.
Right.
Because we realized when we took these medicines that there's only one thing at the very, very core of all fear. And that's the fear of dying. That is the basic fear of everything.
Right. Then you lose everything.
And you lose everything. And once you conquer your fear of dying, there's nothing else to fear in this world.
That's right. Yeah, right. Yeah, well, I can speak to that a little bit. When I started this podcast years ago now, I was a young person. And one of the reasons, I wasn't the most educated about all of this stuff. I didn't know all the scientific literature about psychedelics and all this. But I looked out and I saw no one else really around me talking about this stuff publicly. And I thought, I have to do this. I have to talk about this because I'm a young person and I don't have that much to lose. And it's the people that I see around me that are older that they're just not going to stick their neck out. I just could see that no one else around me was really going to do it. They weren't going to be out there risking losing their job to talk about something that could help all these people. Whereas I just felt like, you know what, I could do this. I could do it. And I felt compelled to do it because these things do have so much potential. It's always felt crazy to me that more people aren't in the streets shouting about this stuff because it really can change so much and so much for the better. I think I could see our whole communities developing differently down the line.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, but there's a few more things I would like to talk about. Well, by the end of it, if we have time, I would even like to ask you about hot springs, because I know here in Whitehorse, there's a hot springs nearby, and a lot of people are interested in going to the hot springs for health benefits. And you actually live on, I think it's Wilbur Hot Springs down in California, right?
That's correct.
So I thought maybe we can go back into psychedelics before we go, but maybe just quickly, I wanted to ask you about what you know about the healing sort of properties and the beneficial properties of people using hot springs.
Well, many years ago, I was fortunate enough to get invited to study at a place called the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. And they happened to have hot mineral springs there coming out of the ground. And so I began researching them. I was teaching at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor at the time. And I discovered that the ancient Greeks called the use of hot mineral water coming out of the ground for healing purposes balneology. And I was fascinated by it. So I researched it more and more, and I became more and more interested. And in 1972, I had the good fortune to be able to purchase a world famous natural hot springs called Wilbur Hot Springs. That it had opened in 1865, but before that, it was a Native American healing and ceremonial ground.
Oh, wow.
Of the Winton Nation tribe. The Winton Nation and the tribe were the Yokadihis. And then in 1865, this place opened as a spa, and I purchased it in 1972. And I've been studying these waters ever since, and of course taking them whenever I'm there, at least twice a day.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And years ago, everybody knew that sitting in the water felt good, but no one knew for sure whether there was an administration of the medicine to the body, because we have this skin that covers us.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But with the advent in recent years of what's called transdermal medicine, where you put a patch on your arm and the medicine goes in through the skin.
Oh, right, yeah.
It's become more and more obvious that what's around us goes inside of us.
We're absorbing it, yeah, right.
We are absorbing all kinds of things, whether it's absorbing by breathing them in or whether it's absorbing by taking them in through our skin. And that's why being around substances that are dangerous and touching them and letting them come in contact with our skin
Mm.
is very dangerous and is to be avoided.
Right.
But being around things that have the power to do us good and are potentially beneficial can be very healing. And so one of the things in the water at Wilbur Hot Springs that people particularly enjoy is the lithium,
Oh.
because lithium is used in medicine as a mood stabilizer,
Huh.
lithium carbonate. And so by sitting in water that's rich in lithium, it has a very soothing effect on the mood.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just the hot springs, the heat of it and everything, but it'll, I guess that means it'll vary from from hot spring to hot spring because they'll have different minerals and different contents in them.
Exactly right. And that's why Wilbur is arguably the most medicinal water anywhere, because of the particular constituency of the water.
Wow.
Now, you did mention it's not just the heat, but the heat is important. And the reason for that is we feel tension for the most part in our musculature. You don't hear people say my blood is uptight or my bones are uptight.
Yeah.
You know, I feel a tightness. You can't feel a tight bone. There is no such thing. We feel tight muscles. Heat expands the material that it's applied to.
Right.
No matter what it is. That's why we put cracks in the sidewalk so that when the temperature increases, the sidewalk has an area to expand to. Otherwise, it would push up and crack.
Right, right.
It's an obvious example.
Mm-hmm.
When we apply heat to our entire body, it expands the musculature and therefore gives us a sense of relaxation, and it's soothing. It takes the tension off, literally.
Yeah.
And at Wilbur, we have various temperatures of water that one can sit in and go back and forth in order to get different levels of muscle expansion. Then there's the constituency of the water and what the particular minerals are. Another aspect of the water at Wilbur Hot Springs is that it's a supersaturated solution of sulfur. Supersaturated. Beyond saturation. Sulfur was the antibiotic of choice before we had penicillin.
Right, right, yeah.
So when you sit in a supersaturated solution of sulfur, it goes into every little pore and every little crack and every little wound and cleans it up and heals it. So it has a remarkable effect on the dermis. Yeah, very interesting.
So I'd be curious then to maybe, I'm sure they must know, I just haven't inquired, but to ask about the Takini hot springs that are up near Whitehorse here and find out what are the main sort of ingredients in their hot spring. That would be interesting to know then.
It would. What's the temperature of those waters that you sit in there?
Well, they divide it into two pools, one hotter and one a little bit more mild. I don't know the actual temperature.
I see. And how far is Whitehorse from Haines?
From Haines, Alaska. You're going to test my knowledge here. Haines is the only place I've actually been to in Alaska, but I think it was maybe 5 hours or so.
5 hours? The reason I'm asking is because I might have mentioned to you that my daughter Sarana teaches yoga in Haines in the summer. And when I go visit her sometimes, I was thinking maybe I could come up to Whitehorse and get in the water there.
Oh, absolutely. That would be awesome. And then we could meet in person too. That would be great.
What's the population of Whitehorse?
It's probably about 35,000 now, something like that.
Oh, it's a good size city.
Yeah, for sure. Bigger than Haines, for sure.
Oh, Haines is 1,700.
Yeah. I really liked it in Haines, though. It was a beautiful place, actually, to visit.
Very beautiful.
Yeah.
So that's the story on the hot springs. And there is one other thing I wanted to mention, because you could do this up in your hot springs in Whitehorse.
Yeah.
In the laboratory, we have something called an anechoic chamber. It's a chamber that you get into, and it's silent.
Oh.
It's built in such a way as you don't hear anything. And there's another way of doing that where there's a chamber that has warm water in it at about body temperature.
Right.
That's salty.
I've heard of that, the isolation tanks.
That's correct. And they were originally called stimulus deprivation chambers and
Right.
stimulus but then we changed it to stimulus isolation.
Right. Yeah.
Because we recognize that when you don't have external stimulation, you still have a lot of internal stimulation. So you're not deprived.
Yeah.
You're simply looking at your own stimulation rather than what's coming to you from the outside.
Right. Yeah. You're forced to just pay attention to yourself.
Correct. And these tanks from the laboratory have been sold commercially. They're called samadhi tanks, and people can buy them for their homes. If you have a hot mineral spring that is very heavily has a heavy chemical constituency to it, a lot of minerals constituency, like the ocean, salt, you will float.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. If you were to go to your Takini hot springs with a snorkel and float face down, it'll be approaching a stimulus isolation tank.
Ah, I see.
You could lay there and not hear much from the outside,
Right.
be totally inside.
You'd have to go at a time when other people weren't there, I suppose.
Maybe, or unless you had a small spot that you could just take for yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
So at Wilbur Hot Springs, I either use a snorkel or I have a position that I can get into so that my head is underwater and there's no visual stimulation and very little sound.
Right.
One of the things we learned, and the reason I'm talking about this now in relation to our talk about psychedelic medicine, is that if one stays in a stimulus isolation chamber or tank for a long enough period of time, the experience has become psychedelic.
Right. Yeah, and that's very interesting. It points to
Very interesting. The one thing, if your listeners and viewers are going to try this, is to remember that in order to get these unusual, maybe psychedelic experiences from being in an isolation chamber, you have to remember to drink a lot of water. It's very important.
Right.
If you're going to be laying in hot water for a period of time, you could be sweating, you'll get dehydrated. You want to drink a lot of water while you're doing it. Otherwise, it's very safe.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. And just like a way for people maybe who don't have access to it, like a sensory deprivation tank, but to try to do that at a hot springs, maybe on a quiet day when you have time, because the water will be heated, so it'll be similar to the temperature of your skin. And with your face underwater and everything, it'll create a similar effect. You can go into kind of a meditative trance-like sort of state.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting that experience can, like, and I've heard the same thing. I actually interviewed someone in Vancouver who runs, it's called Float Lab, I believe. But they run a sensory deprivation tank experience out of Vancouver. So we talked about that. And the fact that can induce a similar experience to these psychedelic drugs, it points to our brains being capable of achieving these states sort of naturally, in a way, like that they're not so foreign, that they're available to us.
Yeah,
they're very helpful.
Very much so.
Yeah,
very much.
Well, I think we might as well wrap it up, Richard. I think that went by pretty quick, but that was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me on your program, Carl. To be continued.
Yeah, and check out Richard's book. Definitely a really great resource. I really do recommend it. I really enjoyed reading it myself, and because it's excerpts from your interview, so it's very easy to read. It's easy to follow along and understand what's being talked about, because it is just people talking about this stuff. It's not all this scientific sort of literature that's hard to follow, but you break it down in a way that's really easy to understand. And yeah, great book. So definitely check it out if you're interested in any of these things we talked about here today.
Thank you, Carl.
Yeah.
Take care.
Okay. Bye, Richard.